Okay, welcome everybody. This is the back end of the chapter dealing with ecosystems, and we had left off looking at some of the cycling of matter and energy through ecosystems. Um, what you should do now is pause this video podcast, and then if you go under the video content area of Blackboard, you will see a real player video on the water cycle. I want you to make sure and watch that video. It's part of the biogeochemical cycles that I expect you to know in preparation for the exam. So go ahead and do that now. And then when you're finished, come back and we will do the next set of concept check questions. Okay, the next set of concept check questions here, a couple of topics we want to deal with. What are the three aspects of an organism's ecological niche? Now remember that a niche is basically a task that an organism carries out within an ecosystem. The three aspects of an ecological niche are all the physical, chemical, and biological factors that the organism needs to survive, remain healthy, and to reproduce. Essentially, a niche describes the physical space in which the organism lives, um, the raw materials upon which it feeds, the area in which it reproduces, and also, in many cases, the organisms that feed off of that organism. Every organism has a role in an ecosystem, and the niche describes that role. Remember that the realized niche is often smaller than the theoretical niche, and that's often due to competition. Next question that we want to deal with is, what is resource partitioning? Resource partitioning is the reduction in competition for environmental resources, such as food, among coexisting species as a result of the niche of each species differing from the niches of others in one or more ways. And this is the result of competition. So again, this explains why the realized niche in an ecosystem for a particular organism is often smaller than the theoretical one. We use the example, for instance, of the birds feeding in the canopy, the work from MacArthur, which detailed differences in behavior and differences in resource utilization within the same basic resource. That would be the canopy and what the canopy holds in terms of food for the organism to feed off of, and also as an area for the organism to nest and reproduce. And what we saw was that competition generated now a very unique behavior and feeding profile and reproduction profile for those birds that lived in that particular canopy in that particular ecosystem. Okay, next thing we want to do is look at interactions among organisms. We're going to distinguish among mutualism, commensalism, and parasitism. We'll define predation and describe predator-prey relationships, and we'll define competition and distinguish between intraspecific and interspecific competition, and we will discuss an example of a keystone species. So organisms are not independent from each other. There are several relationships that can describe the interactions between organisms. Among them are symbiosis, predation, competition, and the idea of a keystone species, which is a special case when we look at these organismal interactions. So let's start with symbiosis. What is symbiosis? Well, it's an intimate relationship or association between members of two or more species. One species lives in or on the other species, and this relationship can be beneficial, neutral, or in some cases, it can be harmful. It's often the result of coevolution, where selection factors pick out behaviors and physical characteristics in which the two organisms can coexist. This is interdependent evolution of two interacting species. An example would be plants and pollinators, and we can see on the next slide an example of this type of coevolution. This is a Hawaiian honeycreeper, and it uses its curved bill to sip nectar from the long tubular flowers of this particular tree, the lobelia. And the idea here is that as the physical characteristics of this tree changed, it represented a selection pressure on the bird that fed off the nectar. And only those organisms that were tailored now to get nutrients from this particular shape of flower, those organisms, in this case with a curved bill, would be fit to realize this particular niche and to take advantage of this particular resource. So, as the flowers changed, so did those organisms that fed off the flower changed. Now, you can argue back and forth as to which change came first. And it's entirely possible that as these birds began to change in their physical characteristics, the plant may have developed different type of blossoms in order for the birds to feed off of it. Because what does the plant get out of the bird feeding off of the blossoms? In this case, it gets the opportunity to pollinate. So again, this is an example of a symbiotic relationship. The bottom line is that this represents now a shift in physical and chemical characteristics between two organisms which are now coexisting in a relationship that benefits each. The honeycreeper gets a source of food, and the plant gets something that can pollinate it. Let's take a look at some of these other relationships. Bee colonies in the U.S. and across much of North and South America are under threat. Coevolutionary relationships between bees and the plants that they pollinate are very specific. If one species is affected in the symbiotic relationship, the species upon which that organism depends will also suffer. Again, you have to keep in mind that in an ecosystem we have relationships between organisms that support both organisms simultaneously, or maybe even in some cases multiple organisms simultaneously. So if one species affected suffers, the others that depend on it will also suffer. Colony collapse disorder is a particular type of disease that has affected the bees that pollinate a lot of the flowering plants in North and South America. Since 2006, 30 to 90% of the bees in colonies in the U.S. have died, and this is due to a variety of factors, among them pesticides, pathogens, parasites, and viruses. So there's not one single cause for this. The bottom line is that bees are necessary for pollination of many important crops and wild species. And without bees, there's going to have to evolve another way to pollinate the plant species that depend on this insect activity. And here we see an example of one solution. Two fruit growers hand pollinate pear trees in China. This is a region where the local bee populations have vanished due to competition from Italian bee species that were introduced to China before the turn of the 20th century. Automated approaches to pollination are currently being developed, however, and the link down there at the bottom is a device called the RoboBee. And what the RoboBee does is it disperses pollen among plants that require it artificially. So this is an example of technology attempting to fill the gap that's left by, in this case, this colony collapse. So take a look at that website when you get a chance. The device is very interesting. If we look at symbiosis, we can split symbiotic relationships into three types. In mutualism, there's an association where both organisms benefit. Examples being the bullhorn acacia and the Acacia ants. In commensalism, one species benefits and the other does not benefit or is potentially harmed. Examples would be tropical trees and epiphytes. Epiphytes, remember, are parasitic plants that grow off of mats of decaying material that are isolated in the canopy, and they use the tree as a way to try and seek out sunlight and nutrition. The epiphytes get the benefit of nutrition in the tree canopy and the light that comes down through the canopy. And how about the tree? Well, you could argue that the tree isn't harmed in any practical sense by the presence of the epiphytes, although you could also argue that perhaps the growth of the tree is somewhat impeded by the epiphytes. You would have to do a longitudinal study in order to establish what the true nature of the relationship is. In parasitism, one species benefits and the other is harmed. This is the parasite-host relationship. There are internal and external types of parasites. Examples that affect humans include ticks. Fleas affect dogs. There are also internal parasites such as the tapeworm or pinworms. They benefit from having a source of food, and the organism, the host organism, suffers as a result of the presence of the parasite through perhaps the loss of nutrients, but also the potential spread of disease. We can look at another example of mutualism up here. If you look at the large intestine of a human being and the bacteria that live in that particular organ, called E. coli. The E. coli are provided a home and a food source, and in turn, they provide for the organism, the human being, metabolic byproducts that we use in order to carry out metabolism. Examples would be vitamin K and certain of the B complex vitamins that we absorb across the wall of the large intestine and into the bloodstream. So here's some examples of some of these different types of relationships in a variety of ecosystems. In the lower left, you see an example of mutualism. The most common in Central America, the acacia ant gets shelter and nutrients from the acacia plant, and in turn, it protects the plant from predators. Okay, so you can see an example of this relationship here. In the middle, you see an example of parasitism. This is a body louse feeding on the body of a human being right here. The louse is about 1/10 of an inch long. It gets a blood meal from the human being. The human being loses blood, loses nutrients, but also is put at risk of infection. The louse, however, is benefited by the availability of food and nutrients. In the right, you see an example of commensalism. Epiphytes are small plants that attach to the branches and the trunks of larger trees. Now, you could argue that in this case, in commensalism, only one organism depends on the other. One of the organisms is not affected and the other organism benefits. That's one way to look at this relationship, although you could also argue that this could be an example of parasitism, where the host is harmed but rarely killed, and the other organism, in this case the epiphyte, benefits. You could say, for instance, that because of the extra weight of these plants on the host organism, it restricts the ability of the tree to grow. Again, the nature of this relationship is a little bit in somewhat of a gray area. Okay, so these are not all hard and fast, easy to categorize types of relationships. Predation is another type of interaction between organisms. This involves the consumption of one species, which is the prey, by another species, which is the predator. It's basically a coevolutionary arms race. The predator strategies are trying to find more efficient ways to catch the prey, while the prey strategies are trying to come up with more efficient ways to escape or avoid the predator. And we can see an example on the next page. On the left, a cheetah is sprinting at high speed to catch its prey. And how does the predator in this case make its living? Well, the cheetah tries to find the old, the young, and the sick among the herd because they're easier to capture. How does the predator adapt to this? Well, they attempt to shelter the old, the young, and the sick with healthy animals in order to obscure the ability of the predator to actually reach the prey. And again, sometimes this works, sometimes it doesn't. On the right, you see a goldenrod spider using camouflage to ambush its prey. Basically, he takes on the characteristics of his background. The prey item, another insect, does not see him and as a result becomes an easy victim. How might the prey adapt to this kind of strategy by the predator? Well, the prey, the insects, might evolve in such a way as to produce a component in their biochemistry that has a bitter taste to the spider. That's one example of a method to avoid predation. The prey might evolve an appearance that's difficult for the spider to detect. It might take on some of the characteristics of the surrounding ecosystem so that they're harder to visualize, harder to find. Or the prey might develop ways of escape from attack, the ability to sense, for instance, a heat signature coming from the spider and avoid it if it were able to detect it soon enough. All these things go on constantly. You have to remember that an ecosystem is constantly changing, and as a result, there are always going to be improvements and counter improvements in the struggle for survival. Here you see another example of interactions among organisms. Here we see meerkats on the left guarding their burrow. If one of the sentries spies a predator such as an eagle or a hawk, it'll alert the other meerkats and all of them will scramble to their burrows. This is a picture taken in South America. On the right, when it rests on the forest leaves, the aptly named dead leaf moth, right here, is difficult for a predator to spot. Basically, it's blended into the background of the ecosystem and as a result is less likely to be eaten. So again, you see an example of how these interactions can co-evolve. Okay, competition is the interaction among organisms that vie for the same resources in the same environment. The interaction among organisms is going to eventually reach an endpoint because resources are limited. And what resources are we talking about here? Food, shelter, living space, sunlight, all are examples of resources that are subject to competition. In intraspecific competition, we have competition among individuals of the same population. Okay, so the same species vies for the resource, and the winner is going to be those members of the species that are most able to take advantage of the resource, and the losing organisms will have to adapt or leave or die. In interspecific competition, we see this between organisms of different species, but the same selection pressures exist. If you're unable to take advantage of the resource and the competition makes better use of those resources than your particular organism, the organism in question, you have three choices. You can adapt or leave the ecosystem, or you can die off. This is the nature of natural selection. It acts upon variation within a living population to select for characteristics that allow those organisms the greatest chance to survive long enough to reproduce. and as a result, their genetic material is going to be overrepresented in subsequent populations. Okay, keystone species is a special case. These are vital in determining an ecosystem's species composition, and it's crucial to the maintenance of an ecosystem. When keystone species are removed, other organisms may become more common, more rare, or extinct. Again, remembering now the nature of ecosystems where organisms have to interact with each other. They're usually not numerous, but they're very influential. They can affect the availability of food, water, or other resources within an ecosystem. An example would be the gray wolf in the American Northwest. Essentially, in areas of the Northwest where the gray wolf became more common, their prey became less common. In areas where the gray wolf depopulated, their prey became more numerous. And you can see an example of that in southwest Ohio. The gray wolf used to range into southwest Ohio, but now its range has become restricted to areas in the American Northwest and Midwest. And as a result, their prey items, in this case deer, have become much more numerous. And I'm sure you've noticed them just driving back and forth to school or as a result of casual contact in your neighborhood. Deer have now expanded their range beyond rural areas into suburban and urban areas as a result of the lack of a predator. Okay, so now we get to our last concept check. What is one example of mutualism and of parasitism? Well, there's a lot of examples, but we can take just some of the ones we've talked about. An example of mutualism would be the interaction between acacia ants and the bull's horn acacia plant. The ants make hollow nests out of thorns at the base of the plant's leaves and gain special nutrients from the leaves. In return, the ants effectively protect the plant from invertebrate and vertebrate herbivores and clear away competing plants. So basically they stand guard. Both species depend on this association for survival. An example of parasitism is a tick on a host's body. The tick benefits from the association with the host while the host is harmed. What is one example of predator-prey interaction or competition? Well, an example of predator-prey interaction would be a hawk preying and feeding upon a meerkat or a rodent. An example of competition would be when two or more individuals attempt to use the same common resource, such as food, water, or shelter, living space, or sunlight. Competition can be either intraspecific, as in two hawks competing for the same rodent on which to feed, or it can be interspecific, such as a hawk and an eagle competing for the same prey item. Next question. What is the difference between interspecific and intraspecific competition? Well, interspecific competition occurs between different species, while intraspecific competition occurs among individuals within a population. And finally, how does a keystone species affect its ecosystem? Well, keystone species are vital in determining an ecosystem's species composition and how the ecosystem functions. The fact that other species depend on or are greatly affected by the keystone species is revealed when the keystone species is removed. These species are usually not the most abundant species in the ecosystem. Although present in relatively small numbers, keystone species exert a profound influence on the entire ecosystem because they often affect the available amount of food, water, or some other resource. The last slide today will be a case study on global climate change. How does it affect the carbon cycle? If you remember back from the carbon cycle video we saw, one of the assertions made in the carbon cycle video is that the use of fossil fuels is producing carbon dioxide at a rate that may affect the Earth's climate. The biggest culprit as put forth in your book, is levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Although, as I've pointed out several times, carbon dioxide is not the most abundant greenhouse gas in the atmosphere. Water vapor is. It's present almost in tenfold excess over carbon dioxide. Levels of carbon dioxide have increased 20% in the last 50 years. A lot of this is generated by the burning of fossil fuels and the clearing and burning of lands and forests. The need to stabilize and reduce emissions with stabilization wedges reduces about 1 billion tons of carbon dioxide per year. And so here we look at an example of a proposed solution to the carbon dioxide man-made global warming phenomena. Currently, a hybrid car costs an average of $5,000 more than a standard gasoline-powered automobile. And the reason that they use less fossil fuel, at least less gasoline, is because they have both an electric and an internal combustion engine in the same vehicle. The electric motor takes over usually when the vehicle is making short, low-speed runs, while the internal combustion engine kicks into gear when making long trips. Now, one of the fallacies regarding this type of proposed solution is that electric cars actually have a larger carbon footprint than their standard gasoline counterparts in a large percentage of the United States, where electricity is generated primarily by the burning of coal, which is another fossil fuel. If you want a web link for this, go to www.newyorktimes.com/4/2012/slash/044/slash/automobiles/how-green-r-electric-cars-depends-on-where-u-plug-in. In addition, they cost significantly more than their gasoline-powered counterparts. So is this a viable solution to the proposed carbon dioxide emission conundrum? And that answer has yet to be seen. If there is a widespread, inexpensive way to make large amounts of electricity, i.e. hydroelectric power or nuclear power, without producing an excess carbon footprint, then such a solution might be viable if and when the price of the vehicle decreases to the point where the average consumer can afford to buy one. At this point, however, it isn't economically feasible. You're actually making a smaller carbon footprint using a standard internal combustion engine. So, with that brings us to the end